Thank you for listening to Pan Out. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button above and leave a comment below so more great people just like you can find it. Chapter 1. He rolled a cigar slowly between his fingers, remembering that he dared not strike a match. From the yellow oblong of a lighted window, the big cowboy's glance moved over the long stone building to another window that was dark and lined with iron bars. Behind those bars, a man would be counting hours right now. 10 years, Rip muttered. 10 years in the penitentiary down at El Paso. Rip wrote, "I was the man who killed Sheriff Greb" on the back of a reward poster. He shaped the paper cylinder on a framed-up charge. Rip shook his mechanically, and then he crumbled it head. He didn't know much about the case, but he did know Rudy McCain. Once he and Rudy had been partners in a little cow outfit in New Mexico, before Rudy had drifted up into this paradox country to try his luck. Beyond the bulk of the jail, the lights of town laid a faint radiance against the night. Rip's glance came back to the lighted window, to focus on the bald head of a man seated in the room. He brought a folded bandana from his pocket and built it into a mask, knotting it securely against his neck. His right hand dropped to brush the black gun at his hip. With his lanky frame melting in the shadows, Rip waited patiently. The bald head belonged to Ben Dettel, deputy sheriff. That much Rip knew, although he didn't know Dettel. Suddenly, from somewhere in the town beyond, a .45 broke out in a stuttering refrain. One shot, another, and another. Silence, and then a second gun barked twice, reports blending. Rip balanced on his toes like a man about to start a race. In the jail office, the bald-headed man pushed to his feet. Rip had a glimpse of thick shoulders, of a squat and powerful body, in the moment before the deputy crossed the room and passed beyond his line of vision. Dettel was moving toward the door. Soft-footed in the darkness, Rip went to meet him. In the town, the guns were roaring again. Rip had counted 5 fast shots before he reached the corner of the jail. His Colt was in his hand when he went around the corner of the building, but already Deputy Ben Dettel was on his way. The office of the jail was wide open. Light was flowing out across the wooden sidewalk, and Dettel was running awkwardly toward the main street of the town. Swiftly Rip slid around the corner and through that open door. He had no nerves, but now he felt a sudden, heady surge of exultation. All of this had been planned beforehand, and now each part was falling into place. He had thought to meet a locked door at the least, but now the door was open and the office was empty, and in a corner of the room was the big desk, just as it had been described to him. He went across the room in long strides and dropped down on his knees before the desk. He tried a drawer, but it was locked. He brought a screwdriver from his pocket and jammed it between drawer and desk, and heard the lock snap. He jerked the drawer open, thrust a hand within, and came up with a whole handful of keys, strung on a ring. Somewhere a gun was barking again. Rip straightened, stood motionless an instant, a big, wide-shouldered man in boots and corduroys and flannel shirt, with gray eyes narrowed to a tense alertness above the blue bandana draped across his nose. He flowed into action again. A heavy wooden door separated office and jail, and it took him a second to select the proper key. Then the lock clicked back, and he looked down the tunnel of darkness of a long corridor. He went through, closing the door behind him. Now he risked a match. Ahead he saw the pattern of iron bars. He went toward them, match flickering. He called softly, "Rudy." Rudy McCain. A shadowy figure stirred behind iron bars. "What is it? What's up?" By matchlight, Rip was fumbling with the keys. "This is Rip," he said. "Get your hat, Rudy, we're leaving here. If I can find that damn key." He found it then. The lock clicked back, the cell door swung wide. The shadowy figure moved toward him. "My gosh. If I didn't know you for an unmitigated liar, Rip." "Some other time, Rudy," Rip said. "Right now, we better be getting on our way." The Bronx are waiting. And then, from beyond the corridor behind him, Rip heard something that stopped the words on his lips, the sound of a closing door, of scraping feet, of boots moving across a floor. He knew that McCain had heard it also, for McCain stood silent at his side. He had closed the heavy corridor door behind him. Now, beyond that door, someone was moving about within the office of the jail. In the solid darkness he saw a light shining ahead, and he knew then that there was a slot in the wooden door. And softly, with infinite caution, Big Rip crept toward that slot. He groped for the door, put his eyes to the narrow crack. It would be Ben Dettel, the deputy, come back again. But it wasn't Dettel. This was another man, taller than Dettel, with a full crop of iron gray hair on his head, with gray mustache close clipped above a steel trap mouth. Rip felt a hand on his shoulder, and he moved aside to give Rudy McCain a glimpse into the office. "Greb," McCain whispered in his ear. "Sheriff Greb." Rip nodded. He had caught the glint of a badge on the man's vest. And he knew now that their luck had run out suddenly, for he and Rudy were trapped here in this pitch-dark corridor, and the sheriff was standing between them and freedom. As soon as Greb saw that broken drawer, Rip kept his eyes glued to the narrow slot. The sheriff had placed some papers on his desk, and now he was sorting through them slowly. One paper he put aside, the others he shoved into an inside pocket of his long black coat. He took the coat off then, and went across the office to hang it on a wooden peg. As he started back toward the desk, Rip saw his glance stop abruptly on that shattered drawer of the desk. The big cowpuncher picked that moment. The wheels were turning, and Rip had gone too far to turn back now. He jerked the big door wide, and leaped into the lighted office. His gun was level in his hand. "Get the hands high, Sheriff," he barked. The sheriff's back had been half turned. Now he whirled. For the space of a single heartbeat he stood motionless, staring at the big man in the blue bandana mask. Rip tilted his gun. "Lift him, Sheriff." The sheriff looked at that leveled gun, and didn't seem to see it. Not for an instant did he hesitate. Not a word did he speak. His hand struck suddenly for the big Colt at his hip. He never had a chance. Rip's gun was high and ready, although he knew he couldn't use it, couldn't shoot that old man down. But his left hand darted out to grab the sheriff's wrist, and then Rip dropped his gun and drove his right fist against the sheriff's jaw. That savage short-arm jolt rocked Greb's head back on his shoulders. His feet tangled, and he went over backward, and falling, his head struck with solid force against the base of the big heating stove which stood in a corner of the office. "My gosh, Rip," said Rudy McCain, "you ought to pull them punches." Long afterward, Rip would recall that moment again, and in his mind each detail would be clear and plain and in its proper place. The sheriff was lying on the floor, arms wide, with his head resting at the base of the cast-iron stove. Rudy McCain, big and raw-boned and freckled, was looking down at him. The sheriff had been holding a piece of paper, and now it lay on the floor beside his hand, and Rip noticed that it was a reward poster. There was a picture and a name beneath it in big letters, but Rip had no time for that. He swept his gun up from the floor, rammed it into leather. He turned the sheriff's head, and saw blood running in a thin trickle through the iron-gray hair. But Rip had looked at blood before. He felt the sheriff's pulse and grinned reassurance up at McCain. "He's all right, Rudy, just stunned. I reckon it's time to go. We better be long gone when this old Jasper wakes up. He's a pretty salty customer." Chapter 2. Outside, they slid around the corner of the jail, went through vacant lots at a dead run. Rip jerked the bandana from his face. Fading through the darkness, he found time to reflect briefly on that gray-haired old man, who had looked at death and tried for his gun. A gamester, that old Jasper. They came to the high walls of a feed corral at the edge of town, and Rudy McCain could hold back no longer. "It was 10 years down at Cannon City, Rip," he said. "I was framed, rottenly framed. Then seeing you in that damn jail, hearing your voice, it still don't seem quite real." Wait till morning, Rip said. We ought to be 100 miles from here by daybreak. The Bronx are just ahead. He was leading the way through darkness in an unfamiliar setting, McCain at his heels. There was some shooting in town tonight, McCain said. Some friends of yours, Rip told him. They built up a little gunfight to stir excitement and pull the deputy from the jail. The sheriff was supposed to be out of town. His eyes had grown accustomed to the darkness, and ahead of him he saw the dim shape of a single horse. He swore aloud. What's wrong, Rip? They had reached the lone horse. Rip's voice was puzzled. We left 2 broncs here, he said. Far off, a locomotive whistled shrilly, and the swinging beams of a headlight stabbed across the darkness of the plain below the town. Rip struck a match and found bridle reins still looped around a post. He picked up a bridle, understanding now what must have happened. Broken headstall, he said. The bronc jerked loose on us. McCain sounded glum. What's to do now, Rip? Take Dixie, said Rip. Dixie was his favorite horse. You'll have to make the ride alone. But you'll be riding a lot of horse. I won't leave you afoot, said Rudy McCain flatly. Rip chuckled. Me. I'll be all right, Rudy. I ain't no criminal. Nobody wants to put me in jail. Then, once again, the silence of the night was broken by the crashing sound of gunfire, 5 swiftly spaced shots. Rip jerked a leather jacket from the saddle, passed the reins to Rudy McCain. Time to go, Rudy. Take care of yourself. I can't leave you afoot, Rip. You always talk too much, Rip said. You'll talk us both back into the Bastille again. Get on that bronc and ride. I won't forget this, Rip. Sure. I'll be seeing you. McCain lifted a hand. Adios. Rip rolled a cigarette and listened to the fading beat of hoofs. A skittish horse and a broken headstall had caused his plans to misfire, but he felt no particular dismay. Rudy McCain was free, which was the thing he had set out to accomplish. A man could always find a horse somewhere. A long train, traveling slowly, was puffing uphill toward the town, the beams of the engine headlight laying a path of light along steel rails. Rip could see the yellow windows of a single coach, bobbing far back at the end of the combination freight and passenger train. Smoking thoughtfully, he turned toward the tracks. He would have to risk a trip back into town again. He was afoot on strange range now, but he was not greatly worried by his plight. He had ridden into this country only this morning, and only 2 men, besides Rudy McCain, knew him by name. The 2 were A1 Wilson and Jim Lambert, the same 2 men who had staged that phony gunfight in town tonight to cover up the jailbreak. Both were friends of Rudy McCain. To be sure, there was also Sheriff Greb to be considered, but he had been wearing a mask when he bumped into the lawman. The engine was crawling by. Rip caught a glimpse of the fireman, silhouetted in the glow of firebox flames, and then a long line of boxcars went by, wheels grinding. The heavily loaded train was barely creeping up the hill. He looked into windows of a lighted coach loaded down with passengers. And suddenly Rip grinned and slipped into his leather jacket, and as the coach wheeled slowly by, he caught the handles and swung himself up onto the vacant rear platform. He had been somewhat troubled about the little problem of slipping unobserved into town. This was one way of accomplishing it. He would re-enter Aligordo as a passenger on the train. A man in a blue uniform with a lighted lantern in his hand came out to stand beside Rip on the platform. Just about there, he said. The big cowpuncher nodded. Yeah. It's been a tiresome trip. And he remembered that this was a branch line railroad, and that Aligordo was the end of the line. Already inside, passengers were standing in the aisle, moving toward the front end of the coach. Rip opened the door, stepped into the car. Nobody paid the least attention to the tall, bronzed-faced man in corduroys, who took his position at the tail of the line of passengers. The train wheezed to a stop. Slowly the passengers disembarked. Rip moved with the line. The coach was very nearly empty, and Rip himself was at the front door, when the man ahead of him in line turned suddenly and started back through the aisle. He was a slim youth in a dark suit, with a strained expression on his face. He shot a glance at Rip and stopped short. "Will you be staying at the hotel tonight?" he asked. The question surprised Rip. "I reckon so." The youth held out something that looked like a red leather notebook. He spoke swiftly. "Please keep this for me. If I haven't called for it by morning, give it to Sheriff Greb. Tell him Don Eakin gave it to you." There was a note of urgency in that slim youth's voice, and in his face was something that was very close to fear. Rip took the notebook. "What's the trouble, son?" "I can't tell you now," the youth said hastily. He turned and went back through the open front door of the car. Rip noticed that he limped as he walked, that he seemed to have one crippled foot. He lowered himself from the steps to the cinders of the station platform, and Rip went down behind him. And then a hatchet-faced man in batwing chaps moved out from the station lights and laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Just a minute, Eakin," he said. "I'd like a word or two with you." The platform was emptying rapidly, with passengers flowing toward the lights of town a block or so beyond. Rip drifted with the crowd, but his mind stayed back on the platform with the youth who had handed him the red notebook. That boy had been afraid. It wasn't the big cowboy's affair, and yet he couldn't quite brush it from his mind. Just ahead, a block of poorly lighted street led to the main part of the town. At the corner of the station, he pulled up for a backward glance, and he saw that the hatchet-faced man and the crippled youth were still standing where he had left them on the platform. The train was backing away from the station now, and but for those two, the platform was deserted. Rip circled the depot and went back toward the platform by way of the other side. Through a lighted window, he saw a man in a green eye shade writing busily under the light of a swinging lamp. He drifted past the window, reached a corner of the station, and stopped there in the shadows. The crippled youth and the man were still where he had left them. The man was saying something in a harsh, metallic voice, but Rip couldn't make out the words. He turned around the corner and saw light gleam on metal in the hatchet-faced man's hand. That ended hesitation for Rip. Soft-footed, gun in hand, he stepped out to close in on the pair. The man in chaps had his back turned. Rip's voice floated across space. "Steady. I've got you covered, friend." The man turned suddenly, saw the gun in Rip's hand. "What in all hell?" "That's what I thought," Rip said. "Let that gun drop to the ground." Under the light, the other's face was ugly. "Listen, mister." Rip notched his hammer back with a little click. "Drop the gun," he said. The gun hit the cinders. Rip closed the gap between them. He could see the man's face clearly now, a vicious face full of venom. The man began a protest. "Let me tell you something." "Some other time," said Rip. He looked at the crippled youth. "Were you heading toward town, son?" The youth nodded. "I was, until this man stopped me." Beyond the rails of the main line, a lone boxcar stood on the siding. The door was open. Rip pointed with his gun, spoke to the hatchet-faced man. "You see that boxcar, brother?" "I see it." "Crawl in there," said Rip. "You'll have a chance to cool off. Listen." Rip lifted his gun. "I'm nervous when I get excited. Better do it the way I say." The hatchet-faced man went into the boxcar. He went reluctantly, but he crawled in, and Rip slid the car door shut and dropped the hasp in place. He went around the car, struck a match, and saw that the other door was already locked. He turned back to join the boy. "We might as well get on to town," he said. They walked slowly toward the lights of Alamogordo. Rip asked no questions. After a space, the crippled youth spoke slowly. "I can't begin to thank you. I think he meant to kill me. I think you saved my life back there." "What's it all about?" "It's a long story," the youth said. He didn't seem to want to talk about what had happened. "That book I handed to you on the train, I'll take it now. And much obliged to you. When I looked out and saw Jim Turpine standing on the platform, I had a hunch. Forget it, Rip said. The big cowboy had just recalled that he had a few troubles of his own. Just a little while ago, he had helped in a jailbreak, and now it was up to him to find some way of getting out of town. Not that he felt any particular alarm, for he believed that the very boldness of his present venture promised safety. No one would think of connecting a stranger, who had apparently just reached town by train, with a jailbreak which had taken place a half hour before that train arrived. Lights gleamed along Alamogordo's Main Street. A crowd had gathered outside the doors of the hotel, and as Rip and crippled Don Eakin came closer, the big cowboy saw that there was some deep excitement here. The crowd was dense so that for a moment he could not see what was taking place, but he heard a harsh voice lift in anger. "Keep on talking, Wilson," the voice was saying. "Keep right on talking, or I'll put a bullet through you here and now." Motion flowed through the crowd. Rip caught a glimpse of one man pinned back against the hotel walls, of another man holding him there, a gun pressed against his chest. And Rip's breath caught suddenly in his throat, for the man against the wall was little A1 Wilson, the same bow-legged little rider, who, with Jim Lambert, had staged the phony gunfight which had given Rip the chance to free Rudy McCain. And now he could see Wilson clearly, and he knew the man with the gun was bald-headed Ben Dettel, the deputy sheriff. Wilson was staring at the gun. And he was talking about Rudy McCain. His name was Rip, little A1 Wilson was saying. Rip. Him and Rudy McCain had been partners down in New Mexico, before Rudy came up here. This Rip had just sort of drifted into the country. He came riding out to the ranch today. He didn't even know then that Rudy was in jail. "Keep on talking," Ben Dettel said grimly. "So we sort of held a council of war out at the ranch this morning, and this Rip gent says why not try to break Rudy out of jail." Muscle made a hard knot at the angle of Rip's lean jaw. Not that Wilson wasn't dealing in simple truth, he was. He was telling the thing as it had happened just this morning. Rip had suggested the jailbreak. "You know how them things go, Ben," the little rider said apologetically. "We all figured Rudy had been framed and hadn't ought to go to the pen. So this Rip says if Jim Lambert and me will rig up a little gunfight for some excitement, he'll try to break Rudy out of jail. We thought Greb was out of town." Dettel's voice was harsh. "How did he know about the keys?" "I was in to see Rudy yesterday," Wilson explained. "After I came out, Greb locked up and I saw him toss the keys in a drawer and then lock the drawer. I knew the keys would be still there because Greb pulled out of town right away." "What sort of looking Jasper is this Rip?" "He's a big guy," said Al Wilson. "Somewhat dark. Sort of a slow talker. I thought he was bright enough, Ben. I sure never figured he'd do anything like he did." "We'll go down to the jail," the deputy said. He made little motions with his gun. "He was bright enough, Al. He got away. He put a bullet through Sam Greb's head, and then he rode away. You're the dumb one, you and Jim Lambert. You two gents stayed behind to face the music." Chapter 3. By dawn of the next day, 3 separate posses had ridden out of Alamogordo. 3 groups of tight-lipped riders, grimly determined to leave no stone unturned in their efforts to run down 2 men wanted for the brutal murder of a sheriff. And in the town itself, one of the men they sought slept peacefully through the night. He arose and shaved and breakfasted, and then he went back to his hotel room to muse on his predicament. It was queer as hell. Last night Rip had doubted the evidence of his ears, but from a high stool behind his desk, the wizened little proprietor of the hotel had confirmed the facts, while Rip scrawled a name not his own across the hotel register. "Yep," the little hotel man had said. "They beefed Greb sure as hell. Put a bullet between his eyes." It meant, Rip mused, that now, sitting here in a little hotel room, he was already a fugitive, with a murder charge hanging over his head. No court of law would ever believe the story he would have to tell to clear himself. No jury would ever believe that he and Rudy McCain had left Sheriff Greb lying on the office floor, stunned, but otherwise all right. He had gone into the jailbreak with open eyes, but the murder of a sheriff was something else. Yet strangely enough, he was safe for the moment, despite his precarious position. Al Wilson had gone to jail, and so had Jim Lambert, the other conspirator in the jailbreak. Nobody else hereabouts knew Rip. Soon there would be pictures scattered around, and accurate descriptions, but for the present he was safe. If it came to Showdown, there would be crippled Don Eakin to testify that he had arrived in town by train a half-hour after the jailbreak. He stood at the window of his room, looking over the long main street. There was quietness in Alamogordo now. The men who could get away were gone with the posse, and the town seemed empty and deserted. And then, as Rip stood at the window, dust stirred at the end of the long street, and two jogging horsemen rode into his line of vision. The riders were nearly abreast of the hotel when a man on foot came through the wide doors of a livery stable across the street and cut into the road to meet them. Something in the appearance of that man on foot caused Rip to watch him with a closer attention, and he saw then that here was the hatchet-faced man he had locked in a boxcar the night before. The three talked briefly there in the center of the street, and then the hatchet-faced man, his name was Jim Turpine, Rip recalled, went back to the livery stable. The riders turned in before the hitch rack of a saloon, left their mounts anchored there, and went in. Rip went downstairs, through an empty lobby, and across the street to the saloon into which the two riders had disappeared. The pair were at the bar now, the only customers in the long, cool room. Rip lined up a dozen feet away, studied the two men with a casual eye. One was immense, grotesque. Above his monstrous barrel of a body, his face was bland and pink, like a baby's face. He was the fattest man Rip had ever seen. His companion was a big man also, but there was a difference here. The second man was deep-chested, broad of shoulder, powerfully built, with a stubble of beard across his dark face, and a coal-black mustache above a bulldog jaw. And something in that dark, bulldog face stirred a memory in Rip. Somewhere he had seen that face before. He couldn't put a finger on the time or place. The fat man was telling a joke. He came to the point of it, and he threw his big head back, and the very walls of the saloon seemed to echo to his booming peals of laughter. His vast girth shook like jelly in a tub. He wiped tears from his eyes and laughed the more. His glance rested on Rip, and seemed to invite the stranger to share the joke. The bartender was lanky in his white apron. He moved to serve Rip. "Hot," he said. "Plenty," Rip agreed. "Make mine whiskey. Fill one for yourself." The fat man skidded $1 across the bar. The pair went out together, the fat man still laughing at his joke. Rip watched them pass through swinging doors. The bartender was filling up glasses. "Funny Nettle ain't riding with the posse," he said. The name stirred an echo in Rip's brain. A man named Nettle had found the dead sheriff. So much Rip had already gleaned. He glanced at the bartender. "That was Nettle?" he asked. "The gent with the mustache," the bartender said. "That was Rich Nettle. Other gent was Banjo Jenkins. Quite a joker the banjo is, always sees the funny side." But Rip was toying with an odd, elusive memory. That heavy bulldog face, somewhere he had seen Nettle before. "This man Nettle," he said thoughtfully. "He looks familiar to me. I'm a stranger here, just came in on the train last night. How long has Nettle been in this country?" The lanky bartender laid two bony hands flat on the mahogany. "I'll drink your drink, mister," he said gently. "I'll swap opinions with you about the weather, or the price of cows, or the chances of hitting a 4-card straight in the middle. About Rich Nettle, I don't know nothing. If I did, I wouldn't talk about it." Rip waved a hand apologetically. No offense. His face looked familiar, that was all. He paid for the drinks presently, and wandered out into the empty, sunlit street. The man with the bulldog face was Rich Nettle, and Rich Nettle had been first to enter the jail after the jailbreak. And Nettle, if a man might judge by the bartender's attitude, was a somewhat salty hombre. Rip had the feeling that he was close to some discovery, if he could but ferret it out. That affair at the railroad station last night, when hatchet-faced Jim Turpine had stopped young Don Eakin. And today Jim Turpine had stopped Rich Nettle and Fat Banjo Jenkins. Rich Nettle it was who had found the dead body of the sheriff. Could it be that there was some connection between these separate events? And Nettle, where had he seen Rich Nettle before? He returned to the hotel, thinking to try for further information from the little hotel man, but the lobby was empty and the desk deserted. Rip went up to his room. He opened the door and looked down into the barrel of a gun. A voice said, "Get your hands up, mister. Fast." It was a girl. It was, Rip decided instantly, the prettiest girl he had ever seen in a long and somewhat misspent life. Her blue eyes were flashing fire, and her face was set in what may have been meant for a ferocious scowl, but none of it altered the big cowboy's first opinion. This girl was out in front, so far as Rip was concerned. In riding garb, she was as slim as a boy, and there were golden curls. "Get those hands up," she snapped. "I've been waiting for you." Rip grinned cheerfully. "That's mighty nice," he said. "I've been waiting for you all my life." She made motions with the gun. "Come inside," she said, and her voice was cool and businesslike. "I know how to use a gun, and this isn't any joke. I want to know what happened to my brother." Rip stared at her. "Your brother? I'm Eileen Eakin. Don Eakin is my brother." Then it was that Rip recalled that he had not seen the crippled youth since last night. In the rush of events, he had almost forgotten young Eakin. "You came in with him last night," the girl said accusingly. "You came upstairs with him. I've found out that much already from Wilkins. Now Don's gone." "Gone?" "Gone," Eileen Eakin said. "His room was not slept in last night. You were the last man seen with him." He faced the girl gravely. "I met your brother on the train last night," he said. "We were strangers, I never saw him before. We walked to the hotel together. The last I saw of him was in the hall outside, when he was unlocking the door to his room. If he's gone, I'm mighty sorry, but I don't know anything about it." Should he tell her of that affair on the station platform last night, when he had interceded between her brother and hatchet-faced Jim Turpine? This girl was badly worried. Her face, her manner, the fact that she had thrown a gun on him, all these things testified that she was afraid of something. She stared up at him. She whispered, "You're lying to me." But now there was no assurance in her voice, and her blue eyes were shadowed pools filled with a haunting fear. "I'm not lying," Rip said quietly. "I hope you will believe me. I'm a stranger, and I didn't know your brother until last night. If anything has happened, I don't know a thing about it." Suddenly the big gun sagged in her hand. "I'm afraid, she whispered and started blindly toward the door. "Don wrote to me." It wasn't Rip's business. He had trouble of his own, more trouble than he could handle. But this girl with the deep blue eyes had done something to him that he didn't quite understand. He wanted to help her if he could. "Suppose you tell me about it," he said. "Maybe I can help." She rested a hand on the door. "Our name is Eakin," she said bitterly. "That would explain most of it to anyone who knows this country." "I'm a stranger," Rip said. "Leif Eakin was our father," she said. "He was the man who started the bank here in Allagord. He disappeared a year ago." "Disappeared?" $100,000 disappeared with him. They said he stole it. They said he looted his own bank and ran away. And then Rip remembered a letter he had received from Rudy McCain months before. Rudy had made mention of hard times, had said something about losing $500 in a bank failure. Rudy had said that the president of the bank had gone south with the money. "It broke the bank," said Eileen Eakin. "It ruined a lot of people, cost some of them their life savings. I can understand why they should be bitter. But it isn't fair to blame us. It isn't fair to blame Don." "You think that what happened?" "I don't know." She made a hopeless little gesture. "People have been bitter. They've made threats. Don wrote me that someone tried to kill him in Denver. He's been over there taking treatments for his foot. He's crippled, you know. He didn't tell me very much about it." She straightened to face Rip defiantly. "It isn't fair. We've done everything we could, both of us, to pay it back. We turned everything that was left over to the bank, horses, cows, everything but the ranch itself. We couldn't give that to them because it was left in trust until I'm 21. That's next month. Then they can have the ranch too." It was all Greek to Rip. "Maybe you're imagining things," he said slowly. "Maybe your brother just stepped out to visit friends or something. Maybe he's gone on to the ranch." Her father had disappeared. Her father had looted a bank and ruined a community and dropped from sight. Now her brother was gone. To Rip, it seemed that Eileen Eakin had had more than a fair share of trouble. He couldn't help thinking about that business on the station platform last night. No need to tell her that. Not yet. "I'm sorry I bothered you," the girl was saying. I must have been a little crazy, I guess. I thought you were a gunman or something, so I sneaked into your room." "I left Don in the hall outside," Rip said. "I haven't seen him since. I wish that I could help you." She tucked the gun inside her blouse. "I'll look around," she said. "I may ride out to the ranch again. After all, Don doesn't know I'm home. I was teaching school over at Pinnan, but the kids got measles and I got a vacation. I hope you'll forgive me." From the hall, Rip watched until the bright blonde head had dropped from sight below the level of the stairs. He went back to his room and sat down on the bed. It wasn't his affair, and yet he couldn't seem to put it from his mind. That crippled boy, that slim and lovely girl. Their father had looted a bank and disappeared. They had been left behind to carry the disgrace. Strange business. Rip stretched long legs and went out into the hallway. He tried the door of the room next to his own, the room that had been assigned to young Eakin last night. The door was unlocked. He went inside. The bed was rumpled and disarrayed, but there was nothing else to show that the room had been occupied. He was turning back toward the hall when he saw a spot of color on the floor behind the dresser. It was a small red book. He picked it up. It was, beyond all doubt, the same book Don Eakin had handed him on the train last night. He recalled the cryptic remark of the crippled boy. "If I don't call for this by morning, give it to Sheriff Greb." Sheriff Greb was dead now, and Rip was wanted for his murder. 3 separate posses were out looking for him. And in the very town in which the sheriff had been killed, Rip was sitting on a bed in a narrow room and thumbing through the pages of a red notebook. It was a diary, he saw that at once, a diary once kept by Leif Eakin, the banker who had disappeared. On the front page was Eakin's signature, and below was the first entry in the book. January 1st. Snow again today, good for the range. Letter from Don arrived. He reports progress with the leg. He is a brave boy. Eileen is visiting the Vickers over the holidays. Rip's eyes skipped over the pages, remembering the importance Don Eakin had seemed to attach to this little book. It recorded, for the most part, unimportant items, the day-by-day record of a man precise in habits but too busy to bother with details. There were items touching upon the bank, on business affairs, and there were intimate bits of family life. Nothing here to suggest that the writer was a thief, who even then was contemplating the looting of his bank, the abandonment of his family. Rip came to the end of it at last, the record of events of the last week entered in the book. June 27th. Something has happened to the lock in our new vault. It will not work, although both Hankins and myself have worked on it. I am writing Kansas City for a repairman. Too much money on hand to trust to a vault which will not lock. I am sleeping in the bank tonight. June 28th. Judd Bennett's gang stuck up the Monte Vista Bank 10 days ago and are reported still in the county. I hope they keep away from here, at least until our vault is repaired. Letter from Don today. He is cheerful. Poor kid, I am afraid he will always limp. There were notes covering the activities of 3 more days, during which the writer made no further mention of the defective vault. Then the final entry. July 2nd. Abe Slater placed $30,000 on deposit today, having sold his ranch to Ross Huffman for cash. Nearly $100,000 in currency on hand, and a vault which can't be locked. When I talked with Banjo Jenkins today, he has the only substantial safe in town in the Pioneer. Tomorrow is Sunday, and the next day will be the 4th of July, a legal holiday. I am thinking of transferring the money to Jenkins's safe until Tuesday. There it ended. The entry for July 2nd was the last one in the diary. Rip closed the book softly, understanding now why crippled Don Eakin had been so anxious that it should reach the sheriff. There was food for thought here. Rip opened the book again to glance at the final sentence. I am thinking O.J. transferring the money to Jenkins's safe until Tuesday. Jenkins, Banjo Jenkins. That would be that enormous tub of a man he had seen in the saloon a little while ago. The fat man with the booming laugh, who had told the joke to Rich Nettle. And Nettle had found the body of dead Sheriff Greb. A queer thread of logic seemed to be running through the pattern of events, but Rip could make nothing of it. Don Eakin had disappeared. Was the answer here, hidden behind words in this little red book? Had Leif Eakin transferred the money to Jenkins's safe, as he had said he might do in his diary? Had he been killed? Would that explain it? Eileen Eakin had told him that someone had tried to kill her brother in Denver. Rip himself knew that the crippled boy had been stopped on the railroad platform last night by a man who very possibly might have contemplated murder. Could it be that this little book was that important? $100,000 is a lot of money, Rip thought, and rubbed his lean jaw thoughtfully. A lot of dollars. Enough to ruin a whole community, to blacken a man's good name, to mar the future of his children. Yes, it was a lot of money. Rip rolled a cigarette and tried to tell himself that it wasn't his affair. He was in a jam himself. He had a full-time job of his own on his hands. Yet he couldn't put that crippled boy out of his head, and he couldn't forget Eileen Eakin. He had thought that he might see the girl again, might have a chance to give her the diary he had found, but the afternoon wore through, and he concluded finally that she must have gone back to the ranch. At last he plowed through dust to the livery stable, across the street from the hotel. A little white-whiskered oldster was sweeping out the office. I want a bronc to hire, said Rip. I want to ride out to the Eakin ranch, Leif Eakin's ranch. The little man put his broom aside. Leif Eakin's gone, he said sharply. Pulled out long ago, broke the town first and then pulled out. You can't miss the ranch though. 8 miles straight north along the road, and you come to a fork. There's a wooden sign with a star-cross burned on it. That was Leif's brand in the days when the Eakins were flying high. He stumped back to the stalls, brought out a rangy sorrel horse, threw a saddle on the animal. How long has Eakin been gone? Rip asked him. That's easy, the little ostler said. Nigh onto a year now. He pulled freight on a Sunday, July the 3rd. The next day was the 4th. I had an idea it would be, Rip said, and he climbed aboard the sorrel. As he turned northward out of town, it occurred to him that he was risking the chance of being picked up by one of those posses now out looking for Rudy McCain and himself. The afternoon was gone. He held the rented mount to a steady ground-covering jog, but even so, darkness was almost on him when he saw a star-cross burned on a board beside the road, and pointing to a side road which turned west into the shadowed darkness of a rock-walled canyon. And it was quite dark when at last, far ahead of him, Rip saw a gleam of light. He rode down a dusty lane. He opened a wooden gate and went through, and before him was a great frame house. The front door was open, and light flowed out across the wide porch, and Rip saw 5 horses anchored in line to the railing of the porch. He added his sorrel to the string and mounted the steps. From the shadows, a man stepped forth to meet him. "What can we do for you?" he asked, his voice flat and unfriendly. "I'd like to see Eileen Eakin," Rip said. "She's busy now," the man said. In jeans, he was long and lean, with a gun strapped on his hip. "Come back some other time." The front door was open, and from his position on the porch, Rip could see into a large, well-lighted room. Eileen Eakin was seated beside a long table. Rich Nettle was standing in the center of the room, looking curiously toward the door, and Rip saw Fat Banjo Jenkins standing beside an open desk. There were more men in the room, but before he could check them off, he saw Rich Nettle start toward the door. The man in denim spoke harshly. "I told you she was busy, mister," he said. "Suppose you ramble on. Come back some other time." But he made a fatal error then, for his hand moved in threatening gesture toward the black gun at his hip. And suddenly, for no reason that he could understand, Rip was seeing red. His gun came up out of nowhere. "Suppose you get to hell out of the way," he said. "I came here to see Miss Eakin. If she's busy, I reckon she can speak for herself." Rich Nettle's big body blotted out light in the open doorway. He loomed huge, formidable, his dark face in shadow. "What goes on?" he said. Rip showed him the gun. "This," Rip said, "goes off. Back up. I want to speak to Eileen Eakin." Rich Nettle stood solidly in the doorway. His heavy voice rasped, "What do you want?" Rip juggled the gun. "I'm hell for politeness. Still, I don't see how it could concern you, friend. I rode out to see Miss Eakin." For a long moment, Nettle made no move. He turned at last, deliberately, and his voice floated back to Rip on the porch. "Gent here claims he wants to see Miss Eakin, Banjo." He looked at Rip. "Come on in." Rip let his gun drop back in leather, and stepped around Rich Nettle and into the lighted room. Eileen Eakin came to her feet as he entered, and he saw that the girl's face was white and tense. Fat Banjo Jenkins stood on pillared legs and watched him without interest. Rip looked straight at the girl. "I didn't mean to bust in like this. I rode out from town to see you." Her smile was something for a man to remember. "It's all right," she said. "I believe these men are leaving soon. If you're not in a hurry." "Not any," Rip said. He moved a chair, sat down. Fat Banjo Jenkins closed the desk. His fat pink face managed to be at once paternal and regretful. His voice was a throaty gurgle. "I'm sorry about all this, Eileen. I was a director in the bank, and I must do what I can. I haven't liked any part of it." Her voice was cool, skeptical. "I understand. Please don't apologize, Mr. Jenkins." Rich Nettle stood quietly by the open door. Rip's glance caught on him for an instant, and again it struck him that he had seen this big, dark-faced man before. Banjo Jenkins picked up his hat, waddled toward the door. "Good night, Eileen," he said. His small, expressionless eyes flicked over Rip thoughtfully, and Rip thought of that final sentence in Leif Eakin's diary. "I am thinking of transferring the money to Jenkins's safe until Tuesday." "We'll ride," said Banjo Jenkins. They cleared out of the room. One man remained, a little, saddle-warped old waddy with a sandy mustache, who seemed to belong here at the ranch. Rip waited until the pound of hoofs had faded. "It's not my business," he said. "I may be butting in. Still, that looked funny to me." "That was a searching party," Eileen Eakin said. "Searching party. They seemed to think they would find something that would tell them where Father had gone, or where the money went. When I rode up just a little while ago, they were ransacking the house. "You didn't find your brother?" She shook her head wearily. "No. I couldn't find him in town, and he hasn't been at the ranch." Rip stirred in his chair. "I'm a stranger." Still, that seemed somewhat high-handed tonight, that searching party business. That fat Jasper seems pretty important in this country, but searching people's houses. Oh, it was legal enough. They had a search warrant. I didn't see it, but they showed it to Uncle Will. She gestured toward the little man with the sandy mustache. "And Rich Nettle wears a badge. Jenkins got him a special appointment sometime back when Jenkins's pothook outfit was having rustler trouble. Jenkins is a cowman, He owns the Pothook brand, a big outfit. Jenkins is wealthy. Everything he touches seems to turn to money. Rich Nettle is his foreman." Rip thought of words scrawled in a diary. He shook his head thoughtfully. All during that long would Jenkins be trying to locate the banker now? Or the money? "A funny thing happened last night," he said. "I didn't tell you about it today, because I didn't want to worry you. I thought maybe it didn't matter. That's partly why I rode out tonight." And swiftly he told the girl the story of events of the night before, of that moment on the train when Don Eakin had handed him a red notebook, of hatchet-faced Jim Turpine, who had waited for her brother on the station platform, of the manner in which he had locked Turpine in a boxcar. "Your brother seemed to put considerable store in the book," he said. "After you left today, I took a look into his room. I saw this book under the dresser. I figure now maybe he might have dropped it coolly, deliberately." Rip thumbed a slug at the legs of the man with the rifle ride out from town. He had been building a theory in his mind, and now it was beginning to look as if the theory wouldn't hold water. For if Leif Eakin had placed that money in Banjo Jenkins's safe, why deliberately might have left it there to be found. He handed her the book. "It's a diary. Your dad's, I think." Eileen Eakin took the little book, turned it in slim fingers, opened the cover. It's Dad's diary. He always kept one. He was particular about it. The last item is dated just a day or so before he disappeared. It made me wonder somewhat." She was turning pages slowly. Rip waited patiently. The little man with the sandy mustaches fidgeted in his seat. At last the girl closed the book. "There never was a finer man than my father," she said. "There was never a man more honest. The bank was his life. I've always known that he didn't steal that money, that there must be some other explanation." "You read that part at the last?" "I read it," Eileen Eakin said. "You think maybe he did leave that money with Banjo Jenkins?" She shook her head wearily. "I don't know what to think. Jenkins owned the Pioneer Saloon then. He'd taken it in on a mortgage, and he sold it out afterward. He was one of Dad's best friends." "Let me see that book," said Uncle Will suddenly. He ran stubby fingers through the pages. He stopped at the last entry, read it through slowly, his lips moving with the words. He stood up, pointed a shaking finger at the girl. "That's it," he cried. "There's the answer right there, Eileen. There's where the $100,000 went, the money they said Leif stole. We can't be sure, Uncle Will." "Listen to me, girl," the little man said harshly. "I was in the Pioneer that day myself. Leif came through while I was at the bar, and he was carrying a suitcase. I remember wondering about it at the time. It was just after banking hours. Leif went on through to the office in back. The safe is back there, you savvy. The saloon was empty at the time, just me on one side of the bar and Long Jim on the other. Banjo Jenkins was back in the office. Leif went back there. I never saw him again." Eileen Eakin was white-faced, trembling. "He wasn't a thief," she whispered. "I've always known he wasn't a thief." An hour Rip stayed at the Star Gross. When he left, Eileen Eakin walked with him to the porch. They had decided by then that, in the absence of a duly appointed sheriff, she should turn the red notebook over to the county judge. On the moon-drenched porch, the girl was slim and lovely. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," she told Rip. This may clear my father's name at least." "I hope things turn out right," he said. And then he rode away wondering how things could ever turn out right for that girl he had left standing on a moonlit porch. But it might be that the diary would serve to clear Leif Eakin's name. And Don Eakin? What had happened to him? Had he disappeared, just as his father had disappeared before him? Did that little red book hold the answer to both mysteries? Had Don Eakin dropped from sight because he knew too much? He shook his head. This was strange range, and there was much he didn't know. Gladly would he have helped the girl in any way he could, but there was little he could do. He rode slumped over in the saddle, letting the sorrel horse make the pace. A sliver of moon floated overhead. He jogged through a sloping cut, where trees laid a shadow across the road. He heard the swish of a rope that brought him wide awake all at once, but too late. From the dark mass of trees above the cut, a rope curled through the air to tighten across his shoulders. One arm was caught. He felt the loop jerk tight, heard a snarling command. "Snake him down." To fight that rope was folly. Rip knew that. Swiftly, instinctively, he did the one right thing. He jerked the sorrel back, spun him around, and with the rope tightening around arms and shoulders, he shoved steel to the horse and sent him charging straight up the darkness of the slope, straight toward a patch of trees from whence had come that swift rope. In the darkness he saw shadowy forms diving away from the plunging horse. He had gained slack in the rope now, and he pulled the loop loose and flipped it over his head. His hand found his gun, and reining down the frightened horse, he sprayed trees and brush with bullets. Crimson flame stabbed at him from somewhere just ahead. The high-walled mountains sent crashing back the echo of roaring guns. There was a sharp stab of pain above the elbow of his left arm, and he knew then that he had been hit. Deliberately he emptied his Colt, and then he whirled the sorrel and sent him plunging across the hillside. Beyond the shelter of a hogback ridge, he pulled the horse down. He sat quietly in saddle for a moment, listening for sounds of pursuit. He heard nothing. Blood was running down his arm into his left hand, and a queer hot anger was pounding through his veins. He knew he had been ambushed by some of Banjo Jenkins's men. He knew there couldn't be any other explanation for the attack. He left the saddle presently, left his horse anchored to a tree. He climbed the ridge and looked across moonlit space toward the patch of darkness from which the attack had come. From here he had lost sight of the road. At his back and below him, the hogback ridge flattened out into a level bowl. He could hear nothing now of those men who had tried to drag him from saddle, but he knew that they must still be in this immediate neighborhood. "They want war," he muttered. He might have ridden off in peace, but he chose another course. He went back to where the sorrel waited. Working fast, out of a length of rope he contrived a set of hobbles for the sorrel's forelegs and slipped them on the horse. He knotted bridle reins across the saddle horn and turned the sorrel loose. The horse, already jumpy, began to drift down the hillside. Rip loaded his gun and went back to wait at the top of the hogback ridge. The horse was dropping down the hillside, toward the level flat below. Awkward in the hobbles, he was making plenty of noise. Loose rocks clattered after him. And crouching behind the shelter of a great boulder, Rip saw a man with a rifle break from a patch of trees 50 yards away and start across the moonlit space of open ground. A second man followed after him. Fooled by sounds made by the hobbled horse, they must have concluded that Rip was beating a retreat. He waited until they were very close, no more than 40 feet away. They were toiling up the slope toward the top of the hogback ridge. He heard a rasping voice say, "He's heading down the hillside." Rip spoke suddenly. "You're wrong, mister. I'm right here behind a rock. Which one of you gents threw that rope?" It was funny. Both men were in the open, in bright moonlight. Tricked by noises made by the straying horse, they had taken no precautions. For a single moment they stood rooted, like two figures turned into stone. Then, with a snarling oath, the man in front threw up his rifle, firing frantically at the sound of that mocking voice. It was moonlight, and they were too close for Rip to miss. Coolly, deliberately, he thumbed a slug at the legs of the man with the rifle, and saw the man go down, as though his feet had been cut out under him. The second man turned to flight. Rip splashed lead at him, but the running man dived for trees and disappeared in darkness. The first man was on the ground, groaning. At last he shoved to his knees and began to crawl painfully back toward the trees in which the other had disappeared. Rip could have killed him then, but he let the man go. He had balanced the ledger on that bullet hole through his arm, and some of his first anger had evaporated. He watched until the crawling man was swallowed by the darkness. Some time later, he heard horses moving beyond the ridge, and knew that the enemy was giving up the field. He waited until the sounds had faded into distance, and then he dropped down the hillside toward that level bowl, where he anticipated no difficulty in picking up the horse he had hobbled and turned free on the slope. But the moon went behind banked clouds as he descended and left the land in darkness. Reaching the level ground, he could see no sign of the sorrel. A judicious use of matches showed him tracks, and he could tell that the animal was still hobbled. Optimistically, he took up the trail. A long time later, Rip came to a cut-bank canyon. He had stumbled all the way across that level plain, and failed to catch up with the sorrel horse. He had lost the animal, and worse yet, he had managed to lose himself, for right now he had no very clear idea as to where the road might be. He was in strange country. He went on through the canyon, cursing ruefully the motive which had caused him to set himself afoot. He reached a road at last. He used more matches here, fruitlessly. There were hoof prints in the soft dust, but no prints of a horse wearing hobbles, and the tracks that showed were headed in the wrong direction. Somewhere along the way, the hobbled horse had detoured on him. Rip decided to give up the unprofitable pursuit. He would have to walk back to the Star-Cross and borrow another mount. The moon came out again from behind the clouds. Rip trudged disgustedly through white dust in high-heeled boots which had never been meant for walking. A blister formed on one heel and grew steadily. Rip trudged on. A mile, and another, and another. There was only moonlight now. And Rip was a stranger in this land, and he didn't know the road, but presently the gnawing conviction began to fasten on him that this road he traveled now was not the road to the Star-Cross. And then at last the road dipped in a long, steep slope ahead of him, and Rip knew his worst fears had been realized. There had been no such dip in the road he had traveled earlier tonight. This was not the road to the Star-Cross. He sat down on a rock to think things over. Of all the dumb fools, he murmured feelingly. Clumsily, he rolled a cigarette while he considered the situation. He was lost on strange range. He was afoot. He was wounded. He was wandering aimlessly through territory which even now was being combed relentlessly by 100 men, all looking for the man who had killed Sheriff Greb. And he was the man they were looking for. Pain from his wounded arm was pulsing in slow waves through his body, and his left hand was wet and sticky with blood. Scraping brush together, he built an Indian fire, and by the flickering light he examined the jagged hole where the slug had torn through the muscles of his left arm. He tore his undershirt into strips and awkwardly bandaged the wound to stop the flow of blood. He put the fire out then. He was lost. He had no idea where he was, and all this country looked alike. He shoved to his feet again and started wearily down the road. He would have to trust to luck to bring him out. The wounded arm throbbed and pounded. He stopped again, long enough to make a sling out of the same bandana handkerchief which had once served him as a mask. With the arm cradled, the pain decreased. He thought of water, long drinks of water, out of a dripping, moss-covered bucket. At long last and far ahead, he saw a bright gleam of light, which vanished almost at once. He kept on toward where the light had appeared, and wondered if he were walking into a trap. The moon flitted in and out of clouds, and finally Rip saw a small cabin perched on rising ground at the head of a shadowed draw. That way he turned his steps. A light showed in the window as he drew nearer to the cabin. He remembered he was a fugitive, a wanted man, and the thought lent caution to all his movements. He circled the cabin and came down on it through a shelter of trees and brush bordering the clearing. Creeping closer, he looked through a window into a room. It was a kitchen, sparsely furnished. There were a stove and table and chairs, and Rip could see the bulk of a cupboard in one corner of the room. A man was seated at the table, doing something with a length of rope. Rip could see his back, his head of tangled black hair. The man turned his head suddenly. Then it was that the big cowboy knew that luck had surely turned against him. This man he knew. This was Jim Turpine, the hatchet-faced man he had locked in a boxcar in the railroad yard the night before. Rip's lips curled back in a painful grin as he crouched there at the dirty window, peering in at lanky Jim Turpine. This was the final touch. There would be no help here. After a long moment, the puncher faded back, until he stood again in the fringe of trees surrounding the cabin. Behind the cabin was a barn and a pole corral. It occurred to him that Turpine must have a horse or two within the BAM. He might steal a horse. But in the end, Rip voted the idea down. To try to steal a horse would be to take a chance on arousing Turpine, and that might result in setting a posse pounding at his heels. It would be wiser for him to wait for daylight, and then try to find his way back to the Star-Cross. At his back, a wooded slope climbed steeply toward the distant mountain wall. He dropped down into timber to sprawl his lanky frame at last wearily beneath a pinyon tree, resolved to wait for daylight before trying to find his way out of this maze. Chapter 4. The night wore on. Beneath the pinyon tree, Rip tried for sleep that would not come. Toward dawn he dozed fitfully, to wake with the sun shining down through leaves into his face, with his wounded left arm stiff and throbbing. Standing up, he saw that from his position here, high up on the wooded slope, he had a clear view of Turpine's cabin down below. Blue smoke made a thin plume above the chimney of the cabin, and as Rip stood looking down into the clearing, he saw the hatchet-faced man carrying a bucket of water from a spring. Beyond the cabin, he could see the road he had followed the night before, running straight out across a level plain. On that road now dust was stirring in the far distance, and it appeared that a party of horsemen was riding in the direction of Turpine's cabin. Jim Turpine came out into his yard and stood looking toward that moving cloud of dust. Once more the hatchet-faced man entered the cabin, to emerge with something that might have been a tray. He cut across the yard toward a sod-covered cellar, some 50 yards beyond the house. He unlocked the cellar door and disappeared. Minutes later he came out, empty-handed. The dust was closer now, and Rip saw that it had been kicked up by 4 horsemen riding toward the cabin. The men pulled up before Jim Turpine's door, and the hatchet-faced man came out to talk with them. Rip felt a growing interest in the scene. One of the horsemen was Banjo Jenkins, and he was sure that another was Rich Nettle. After a brief conversation, Banjo Jenkins and Nettle followed Jim Turpine around the cabin. The other 2 riders remained in saddle, but Jenkins and Rich Nettle trailed Turpine to the door of the sod-covered cellar. A thought stirred in Rip's weary brain. Don Eakin. Had blind luck led him to the crippled boy? He waited patiently. The pain of his wounded arm forgotten now, he crouched in brush and watched the door of that sod-covered cellar. The 3 were staying inside a long time, and the longer they stayed, the greater grew Rip's conviction that he had stumbled onto the answer to the mystery of young Don Eakin's disappearance. The 3 came out finally, talked for a moment in the yard, and then Banjo Jenkins and Rich Nettle once more climbed into saddle, and the 4 men rode away. Jim Turpine went back to the cellar, and seemed to be locking the door. Then he returned to his cabin. 15 painful minutes later, Rip knelt in underbrush not 50 yards from that cabin. That long it had taken him to reach this position, snaking his way cautiously through trees and brush. Now, wounded arm hanging in a sling, he gave thought to the best way to approach the cabin. Bright daylight now, and 50 yards to cross, with Jim Turpine in the cabin. Turpine was not a pleasant customer at best, and now, if what Rip suspected were true, the man would be pure rattlesnake. Circling the clearing carefully, Rip saw that one side of the cabin had no windows, and he knew that here lay his best chance to cross that open space unobserved. He broke from shelter to race down on the cabin, and he pulled up unseen in the shelter of log walls. Gun in hand, he crawled around the corner. He reached a window and cautiously peered inside. Neither blind nor curtain had the window, and the cowboy found himself peering into an empty, untidy bedroom. He crawled on. From that one glance inside, he knew that the cabin had but 2 rooms, and since the bedroom was empty, Jim Turpine must now be in the kitchen. He slid around a corner of the cabin, and he saw then that the kitchen door was closed. He had to crawl under a window to reach the small stoop before the door. On the stoop, he came swiftly to his feet, gripped the doorknob with his left hand. But at the precise moment that he set to jerk that door wide and fling himself into the room, he heard a small sound at his back. He whirled like a spinning top. Jim Turpine had just come through the door in the makeshift stable behind the house. He was just as surprised as Rip. They weren't 30 feet apart. Then suddenly Jim Turpine was galvanized into action. With a snarled oath, he stabbed for his gun. The 2 shots blended in one report, and echoes bounced back from the rugged mountain wall. Rip heard Jim Turpine's bullet smash through the wooden door above his head. He saw the hatchet-faced man take 2 quick steps and go face down in the dirt. Rip closed in on him. Turpine's gun lay on the ground. The man himself was sprawled face down, and Rip turned him over. He saw a great bloody stain spreading swiftly across the front of Turpine's faded blue shirt, and knew that the other man had passed beyond the need of help. He crossed to the sod-covered cellar, but there was a rusty padlock on the door, and he had to go back and search Turpine's pockets for the key. He unlocked the padlock and pulled the cellar door open. He went into cool darkness, and for an instant, after bright sunshine, his eyes could make out nothing at all within the room. Then he heard a voice. "What do you want now?" That voice was inquiring wearily. "I've told you all I know." Rip lit a match. A man, bound hand and foot, was lying in a corner of the cellar. Don Eakin. "Not yet, you haven't," Rip said cheerfully. "You haven't told me what you're doing here." With a pocket knife, Rip slashed the ropes that held Don Eakin bound. He had to help the crippled boy to his feet, had to half carry him through the cellar door and into the bright sunshine. He saw then that Eakin's face was covered with dried blood from an ugly gash across his forehead. "I've heard tell of guardian angels," the boy said weakly. "I never much believed in it, but I guess you must be mine. This is twice." Rip was looking at the gashed forehead. "How did that happen, kid?" "Rich Nettle hit me with a gun." "Why?" "He didn't say," Don Eakin said. "How did they get you out here?" "They came into my room that night," Don said. He shook his head. "Funny, it was just the night before last, wasn't it? It seems like something that happened months ago. I was asleep, and when I woke up, one man was standing over me, holding a lighted match, and another was pushing a gun against my head." "Who were they?" "3 of them. Jim Turpine, I didn't know the others. They made me dress and took me down the back stairs of the hotel. They had horses waiting in the alley." "What did they want?" "Money." "Money," Rip said. Young Don Eakin's voice sounded tired. "They wanted the $100,000 my dad was supposed to have stolen from the Alamogordo Bank. You see, Banjo Jenkins and Rich Nettle think that money is somewhere out at our ranch." Rip said, "This thing is getting complicated. Let's go inside and wash that cut and slap a bandage on it. You can tell me while I'm patching you up." There was a fire in the cabin and hot water on the stove, and Rip set to work sponging blood from the ugly gash on the crippled boy's forehead. "You say they figure the money's still at the ranch," he said. "That's what they told me," Eakin said. "Oh, they told me quite a lot before they were through with me. I guess they figured that dead men tell no tales, and that I was as good as dead. Only, they had to let me live a while longer, because they thought I had some information they needed. They did quite a lot of talking, and yet I should have figured it out long ago myself, because it was all there clear and plain. Only Banjo Jenkins had me fooled." Rip soaked a rag in water. "He's a peculiar Jasper. He was one of Father's best friends," Don Eakin said. "He's eaten dinner out at our place 100 times. He was big and fat and good-natured, and everybody liked him. He always had a joke, Banjo did. It used to be funny seeing him and Rich Nettle trailing together, because everybody knew that Nettle was a gunman and a killer. And all the time, the Banjo was worse than Rich Nettle ever thought of being. Nettle hit me with a gun. But it took Banjo Jenkins to do this." And suddenly he held his left hand up, and Rip saw that the fingertips were blistered and red and raw. The puncher took that pitiful hand and stared at it. "Jenkins did that. He held matches to them. Seemed to think I wasn't talking quite fast enough." Rip's lips tightened. "That was about the money." "You've got a right to know," Don Eakin said. "It goes way back. You see, when Dad was in the bank, he had a cashier named Hankins. This Hankins was supposed to be from the East, but somehow Banjo Jenkins had something on him. I don't know what it was, because Banjo didn't go into that, but he had enough on Hankins to get him to jam up the lock in the new vault Dad had just had put in the bank. Hankins fixed it somehow so the lock wouldn't work." Rip nodded, remembering Leif Eakin's diary. Banjo Jenkins was figuring on bank robbery then. Eakin said slowly, "Of course he'd have stayed in the background. He was just the brains of the deal. But he knew the lock was on the bum and he was ready to move. And then Dad came to him one day and told him all about the lock. You see, he was Dad's friend. And Dad wanted to know if he could use the Banjo's safe for a few days, until he could get a man to fix the vault. You should have heard Banjo laugh when he told that part of it. He's got quite a sense of humor, Banjo Jenkins has. So he told Dad sure, that he could leave the money in his safe. That was when Banjo owned the Pioneer Saloon. He sold out afterward. The safe was in the office in back of the saloon, and that same afternoon, Dad brought a suitcase back and put it in the Banjo's safe. Then Banjo locked the door. That was on a Saturday afternoon." He looked up at Rip. "They killed Dad that same night," he said steadily. "Rich Nettle trailed him out of town and shot him in the back. And then he buried the body." Rip shook his head. "Banjo Jenkins told you that?" "He told me all about it. He seemed proud of the trick. Dad was dead and buried, and the money was gone from the bank, and people were bound to figure that Dad had stolen the money and run away. And all the time, you see, the money was in that suitcase back in Banjo Jenkins's safe." The crippled boy stared up at Rip. "Only it didn't work that way," he said. "The suitcase was full of books." "Books?" "Books," Don Eakin said. "There wasn't any money. Maybe Dad had a suspicion that day, maybe he changed his plans, but anyhow, some way he crossed the Banjo up. The money wasn't in the bank, and it wasn't in the suitcase." "Let me see that hand," said Rip. Eakin held out his burned fingers. Rip found some salve and went to work on the burns. "It was $100,000, Eakin said. It was gone and Dad was gone, and everybody figured he'd run off with the money. Everybody but Banjo Jenkins. Banjo knew what had happened, but he didn't know what had become of the money. He thought Dad must have hidden it out at the ranch, but he didn't know where. Then Eileen, that's my sis and me, began to sell off the stock to give the money to the bank. We couldn't sell the ranch until Eileen was 21. He flinched slightly as Rip began to bandage the burned hand. Eileen was teaching school over at Pinnan. I was in the hospital in Denver. We'd left Uncle Wilmore to sort of look after things at the ranch, but there were lots of times when Uncle Will had to go to town. Banjo Jenkins and Rich Nettle went through the house a dozen times while Uncle Will was gone, but they couldn't find any trace of the money. I guess both of them must have been half crazy, thinking of all that money lying around somewhere, and them not able to put a hand on it. It would be aggravating, Rip agreed. I took a trip home 2 months ago, Eakin said. At the ranch I raked up all of Dad's old papers, everything I could find. I wanted to see if I couldn't find something, some reason to explain what had happened. I found a diary of Dad's, and in it was something that should have put me on Banjo Jenkins's trail right away. But I didn't get it then. You see, I'd known Banjo Jenkins ever since I'd been a kid, and I thought he was one of Dad's best friends. But in this diary, Dad had written about the lock of the vault, and he put down that he was thinking of leaving the bank money in Banjo Jenkins's safe for a few days. Carefully, Rip was bandaging that burned hand. Don Eakin watched him for a moment. So I wrote to Jenkins. I asked him if Dad had left anything with him before he disappeared. Jenkins wrote back that he hadn't. But my letter must have worried him, because a week later, my roommate was killed. Your roommate? He was killed one night at the door of the rooming house. He was just about my size, and he had a limp just like mine. We'd met in a doctor's office where we both were taking the same treatment. That was how we started rooming together. You figure the bullet was meant for you. I know it now, the boy said. Banjo Jenkins had sent a man over to Denver to kill me. He didn't know what I'd found out, but he thought it might be dangerous. He told me about it today, just before he burned my fingers. That killing sort of opened my eyes. I thought maybe I better bring that diary back and show it to Sheriff Greb. That was the night I met you on the train. I saw Jim Turpine waiting outside on the platform. I knew he worked for Banjo Jenkins off and on, and I had a hunch maybe he was waiting for me. I found that diary in your room yesterday, Rip told him. I gave it to your sister. Don Eakin stared at him. You gave it to Eileen. You're wrong. Eileen is teaching school over at Pinnan. You couldn't have given it to her. There was some measles, Rip explained. She got a vacation. She's at the ranch. I was talking to her last night. Eakin came to his feet. You mean, he asked incredulously, she's at the ranch now? She should be. What's the matter, kid? For the crippled boy was standing now, and he was staring at Rip the way a man might stare at a ghost. She's at the ranch, he said. What's wrong with that? The crippled boy's face was ghastly. They were burning my fingers, he said unsteadily. They seemed to think I might know of some secret hiding place where Dad had put the money. They thought I'd found out about it somehow. So I told them that there was a hidden compartment in the stone fireplace in the living room. I told them I'd found a letter, that Dad had hidden the money there. They said they'd come back and kill me if I lied, but I knew they meant to do it anyhow. You mean there isn't any such compartment? Don Eakin shook his head. No. It's just a fireplace. It was in the house when I was born. But Banjo Jenkins and Nettle think the money's there. And if Eileen is at the ranch. I guess, said Rip, we better see can we rustle us a pair of broncs. Chapter 5. They found 2 horses in the makeshift barn behind the cabin. Don Eakin's left hand was swathed in bandages now, and Rip had a bullet hole in his left arm. But between them they managed to get saddles on the horses. Rip dragged the body of Jim Turpine to the shelter of the BAM and closed the door. He came back and handed Turpin's gun to young Eakin. This might come in handy, he said. Then they rode. For a mile they followed that same dusty road over which Rip had wandered aimlessly the night before. And then young Eakin, riding in front, quit the road to send his mount racing straight across a broken, gully-torn expanse of wasteland. "We'll cut the ranch road in 2 miles, he shouted back to Rip. He could ride, that boy. He had one injured hand, one crippled foot, but he was setting a reckless, headlong pace across the broken ground, and Rip was pounding at his heels. But Rip's thoughts were riding far ahead. For it was more than likely that Banjo Jenkins and his crowd were already at the ranch. There was the chance that they might have found nobody there, that Eileen and saddle-warped little Uncle Will Mort might have ridden into town to deliver Leaf Eakin's diary to the proper authorities. But there was another chance that Jenkins might have found the girl still at the ranch. Rip shook his head. A man couldn't see into the future. He could only take things as they came. They went down a rock-strewn slope at breakneck speed. The cowboy saw a ribbon of white dust ahead of them, and then they were on the road to the Star-Cross. Don Eakin shot a glance at him. Beneath the white bandage, the boy's face was tense. 3 miles to the ranch, he said. Rip threw up a hand. Wait, Eakin jerked his horse down. What is it? Listen to me, kid, Rip said. He spoke swiftly, urgently. Let's do some figuring ahead. Let's figure those Jaspers are already at the ranch. The moment they see you, they'll know the play is over, and then all hell is going to break loose. And if Eileen is there. Don Eakin stared at him wildly. We can't help that now. We've got to do what? How far is it to Aligordo? About 9 miles. You're setting a good bronc there, Rip said. Pound him on the tail, and you can make town in less than an hour. In another hour, you can be at the ranch with a posse. We've got to remember there's 3 men riding with Banjo Jenkins. 3 tough gents if I'm a judge. That figures the odds 2 to 1. You mean, Don Eakin was incredulous, we should ride on to town for help? You ride, said Rip. I'll go on to the ranch. I'm a stranger here. Those gents don't know me. They won't be looking for trouble from me. With any kind of luck, I'll be able to stall them until you can get back with help. But Eakin shook his head grimly. Eileen's my sister. You ride to town, I'm going to the ranch. You're riding to town, Rip said. You listen to me now, kid. This is the only way. We've got to think about Eileen. It took time, too much time, but in the end Rip won his point. In the end, persuaded against his wish, young Eakin whirled his mount and sent him racing at gallop down the road toward Aligordo. And before he had swung from sight around the first curve, Rip was on the ground, examining tracks in the soft dust of the road. He climbed back into saddle, knowing now what lay ahead. 4 riders had passed along this road, just a little while before. In the soft dust, the tracks were still fresh, still undisturbed. Banjo Jenkins and Rich Nettle, and 2 others were ahead of him. He kicked his horse into a gallop, sent him racing down the road. He had his bearings now, and he knew where he was going. After 2 miles, he dived his mount into the shelter of a deep gulch running parallel to the road. He was building plans ahead. This horse he was riding now had belonged to Jim Turpine, and it was possible that Jenkins or Rich Nettle might recognize the animal. And that meant that he would have to discard the horse before he reached the ranch, that he would have to approach the Star-Cross on foot. He would have to plan a story to explain that fact. He reined his mount in abruptly. The gulch had widened suddenly, and ahead of him now, in the center of a great triangle of green plain, lay the buildings of the Star-Cross brand. The big house sat on the top of a rolling knoll. Behind it lay buildings and sheds and pole corrals, and all the paraphernalia of what at one time must have been a big cow outfit. And before the long porch stood 4 horses, standing slack-hipped in the sunlight. Deep in the high-walled gulch, Rip anchored his horse. Crawling up the bank, he stopped for just a moment to study that peaceful scene spread out before him. Smoke curling from the chimney of a big white house, 4 horses standing side by side in sunshine before a porch. There was no further sign of life somewhere. In the swift current of events, he had forgotten his wounded arm, but now, as he rested on the gulch bank, pain rolled over him in slow waves, although the arm itself felt numb and dead, like a piece of wood. He brought his gun from holster, looked at it, and shoved it back into the leather. Then, crawling up the bank and stepping out boldly, he started down the dusty road toward the house. He was in the open now, moving in plain sight of anyone who might be watching from the house. This part of it he didn't like, but there wasn't any other way that he could see. The house stood in the open, and to have tried to approach it by stealth would have used up time that Rip didn't have to spare. He came to the big wooden gate before the lane. He went through, closed it carefully behind him, and walked on toward the house. And if he had felt any faint doubt before, he knew now surely that this was Banjo Jenkins's crowd here at the house, for the big black horse at the outside of the string was the same black horse Banjo Jenkins had been riding that morning. For a moment Rip's mind dwelt musingly on that monstrous man with the booming laugh and the baby face. He thought of Don Eakin's burned fingertips. No matter now. The big house was very close, and in seconds now he would know what he was facing. He would know if the men had found Eileen here. He stepped up onto the porch. The living room door was open. And then, suddenly, Rich Nettle's big square body filled the doorway. Rich Nettle had a 6-gun swinging in his hand, and his face was like a mask. "I guess," Rich Nettle said, "you better put your hands up, friend." Rip stopped. It was Showdown, a trifle sooner than he had anticipated. He looked at Nettle's gun, and lifted his right hand shoulder high. "I thought this was the star-crossed spread," he said. "I didn't know you gents had moved in here permanently." "Turn around," Rich Nettle said. He came out on the porch to lift Rip's gun from leather. Behind him, Banjo Jenkins appeared in the doorway, to watch the operation with a bland smile on his fat, full-moon face. Nettle looked at him. "What'll I do with him, Banjo?" The fat man beamed. "Bring him inside, Rich," he said genially. "Bring him right on in." Rich Nettle jolted his gun solidly against Rip's back. "You heard what the banjo said." The fat man faded back into the living room. Rip followed him. He stopped just beyond the doorway. He saw Eileen Eakin seated quietly in a chair pushed back against the wall. The girl looked up at him as he entered the room, and there was some message in her blue eyes that Rip couldn't read. She didn't speak. Her slim body was stiff and straight in the chair, and Rip knew that her hands were bound behind her back. And then, not 4 feet from where he stood, the cowboy saw the body of little Uncle Will Mort lying face down in a spreading pool of blood with a gun just beyond his outstretched fingers. And Big Rip looked at a clock ticking on the mantelpiece across the room. 10 minutes after 1. Don Eakin was racing into town for help. How long had he been gone now? 30 minutes. Rich Nettle's gun was hard against his back. Banjo Jenkins was standing still, looking at him. The banjo's flabby hands were folded across his swelling paunch. "You picked a poor time to call," said Banjo Jenkins. "What brought you here today?" 10 minutes after 1. Time was the trick now. Don Eakin should be nearing Aligordo. It would take a posse an hour to ride from town to the ranch. If he could stall this crowd. A broken-nosed rider in jeans and batwing chaps was leaning negligently against the big fireplace built into the farther wall. Another, a smaller, fox-faced man, stood by the door. The fireplace was of stone, and it had been built solidly and well, but Rip saw that now a comber had been torn away. Evidently he had come upon them in the very act of wrecking the fireplace, looking for that secret compartment which young Don Eakin had told them they would find hidden in its wall. They would find no such compartment. In his desperate need, the crippled boy had built that story out of whole cloth. But it would take time for this crowd to wreck the fireplace, to find that they were following a false lead. And if Don Eakin met with no mishap along the road to Aligordo, Rip looked at fat Banjo Jenkins. "I'll tell you," he said slowly. "Some jaspers tried to dry gulch me as I was riding into town last night. They shot me through the arm. I lost my horse, and then I got lost myself. I slept out last night, and I've been wandering these hills all morning. Then, just a little while ago, I saw this place, and thought maybe I could borrow a horse to get back to town." "I see," said Banjo Jenkins. He stroked his fat chops musingly. He looked at Nettle, standing with the gun shoved against Rip's back. "Suppose we tie him down, Rich. Suppose we tie him down until we see what happens." They tied Rip in a chair, across the room from Eileen Eakin. The broken-nosed puncher did the work, while Nettle stood by with his son. Disregarding the wounded arm, they tied his wrists behind his back, and then they bound him in the chair. Then Fat Banjo Jenkins spoke benignly. "That will hold him, Saul, that will do." His little, flesh-buried eyes rolled over Rip. "You see, my friend, you butted into a little private matter. We're busy now, but we'll get around to you." Only by an effort did Rip keep his eyes away from the clock. "Don't bother about me," he said mildly. "I can wait." "Let's get on with the job, Rich," said Banjo Jenkins. While Rip watched from his chair, the men resumed their task of demolishing the big stone fireplace. Banjo Jenkins took no part in it. Banjo Jenkins stood by, a huge grotesque figure of a man with hands folded over his vast paunch, and watched Rich Nettle and broken-nosed Saul tear at the solid stone of the fireplace wall. The fox-faced man had gone outside, apparently to serve as lookout. It wasn't real, that scene. It was like something lifted out of a nightmare. Rich Nettle, his sleeves rolled back to show the great corded muscles of his arms, was systematically tearing that fireplace apart with strokes of an iron bar. He laid the bar aside and picked up a sledgehammer. Saul was trying to drag crushed rock out of his way, but it was Nettle who was doing all the work. He was smashing the fireplace into chunks of rock with crushing hammer blows. And over against the wall, Eileen Eakin sat in her chair and watched with never a word. She was slim and lovely, and she had known too much of trouble already, but she was not afraid. Her chin was high, and there was no fear in her face. But it was Banjo Jenkins who dominated that scene. On pillared legs, the huge man stood braced, hands folded, and on his fat full-moon face there was no least sign of emotion. Nothing showed through, not even curiosity, as big Rich Nettle smashed and hammered at the stone. Rip thought of Don Eakin's horribly burned fingertips. And then Rich Nettle laid the hammer down. One wall of the stone fireplace was completely gone, and the rest had been reduced to crumbled stone. Perspiration made a thin streak along Nettle's forehead, ran through the dark stubble on his jaws. "That damn thing is just stone, Banjo," he rasped. "That story was a lie. There ain't no secret compartment here. Now take it easy." "Rich," said Banjo, "you haven't reached the back. Keep on a little longer, Rich. I tell you there's nothing there. It's $100,000 if we find it, Rich. It's worth a little work. And we've got lots of time. 20 minutes to 2. Don Eakin should have reached Alamogordo by now. Perhaps right now a posse was forming in the town. How long would it take them to reach the ranch? Nettle picked up the hammer again. He smashed at the rock with savage, raging blows. He fought that fireplace with vindictive fury, as he might have fought a man. He grunted with each solid blow, stopping only long enough to wipe sweat from his eyes. Flying white rock powder colored the dark stubble along his jaw. The hammer blows rang loudly through the big house. Rip watched. There was nothing in that fireplace. There had never been anything in it but solid stone. What would this crowd do when they found it out, when they understood at last, beyond all doubt, that crippled Don Eakin had sent them on a wild goose chase? How much longer would it be before they knew? Not long. The fireplace was crumbling under Nettle's furious assault. One side was completely demolished, and the other was just a rubble of broken stone. 10 minutes now, these men would know surely that they had been tricked. And then Rich Nettle brought the hammer down in another smashing blow, and there was no ring to the sound. There was instead a dull and crunching noise that might have been made by a pasteboard box collapsing, and Rip saw that the head of the hammer had broken through the fireplace wall. Rich Nettle jerked the hammer out, struck 3 sharp tapping blows. In the wall, a black hole was appearing now. Nettle laid the hammer aside. He went down on his knees, thrust hand and arm into that blackened yawning hole. He fumbled there for a moment. He looked up at Banjo Jenkins, and his dark face was transfixed. "It's here," he cried. "The money's here." He brought his arm out then. In his closed hand he held a great wadded mass of greenbacks. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, and everything was changed. Everything was changed now, because these men had found the money. It was strange. In desperation, trying to save himself from torture, young Don Eakin had sent them on a wild goose chase, and he had sent them straight to that hidden cache. He hadn't meant to do that. Rip knew the crippled boy hadn't known that the money was there. But there it was, and everything was changed because of it, and the clock on the wall across the room was striking 2. Rich Nettle was smashing at that fireplace again, tearing wider that black and yawning hole. He was working furiously with a madman's strength. He went down on his knees, clawing back the loose rocks with his hands, and then from the hole he lifted a square iron-strong box. The lid was already open, and Nettle thrust a hand inside and came up with another handful of bills. $100,000, he said, and his voice was soft and filled with wonder. "It's right here, Banjo, every dime of it." He was piling money on the floor. He was pulling money from the iron box in great handfuls, package after package of green currency, and he was building a little mound in the center of the floor. "Get a sack, Saul," Banjo Jenkins said. It didn't seem to touch the fat man. Rich Nettle's excited voice had brought the lookout from the porch, and the 3 of them were staring at the money, wide-eyed as children at a Christmas party. But Banjo Jenkins stood back, unmoved, unperturbed. "Get a sack," he said. "We'll put it in a sack." He wasn't quite human, that huge man. There was something wrong with him, some twisted kink in his brain that made him different from other men. If he hadn't known it before, Rip knew it now. And Banjo Jenkins looked at the girl across the room. "You see, Eileen, my dear," he said in his throaty, gurgling voice, "Leaf stole the money after all." "That's a lie," the girl said clearly. "If Father put that money there, he had some good reason for it." They were shoving the money into a gunny sack, stuffing packages of currency into an old sack, as if it was so much worthless paper. The fat man watched them idly. It didn't seem to touch him. He watched Big Rich Nettle carry the money from the room, and then he spoke to Saul. "Take Eileen out of here," he said. "Where?" "The next room," said Banjo Jenkins. Saul shuffled toward the girl. Her hands bound behind her back, she stood up without speaking. She looked across at Big Rip with a smile. "Goodbye," she said. She caught the cowboy by surprise. "Goodbye, Eileen," he said. It wasn't what he had meant to say at all, because he wasn't ready to say goodbye to Eileen Eakin yet. But now the girl was gone. The girl was gone, and Banjo Jenkins was looking at him oddly, and he saw now that the banjo had a 6-gun in his hand. "This is tough on you, my friend," said Banjo Jenkins. "You could have saved yourself some trouble by walking around this ranch. You might have lived to be a real old man." Rip knew what he meant. Although the fat man's face was bland and his voice was softly regretful, there wasn't any chance for the bound man to miss his meaning. Uncle Wilmort was lying dead there on the floor, and now it was Rip's turn. "I see what you mean," Rip said. "I can see how it might be unhandy for you if I was to go on living. That's what you're getting at, isn't it? I'd like to know, because if you're figuring to beef me, there's one little matter I'd like to straighten out before I go." Banjo Jenkins was toying with the gun. "What's that?" "My name is Rip," the cowboy said. "Rip Campbell. Would that mean anything to you?" The fat man blinked. Not the hombre who pulled off that jailbreak the other night." "The same," said Rip evenly. And if I've got to die, I'd like to straighten out that business before I go." "They've got your partner in jail now," said Banjo Jenkins. Rip looked up sharply. "How's that?" "They've got Rudy McCain in jail in Alamogordo now. He rode in last night and gave himself up. He said he decided to surrender as soon as he heard that Greb had been killed, said that he didn't want to be blamed for a killing he hadn't done." The fat man shook his head sorrowfully. "But I'm afraid he's due to hang just the same. They were talking lynching when we rode out of town last night." And suddenly Banjo Jenkins laughed. "Funny thing," he said. "It turns out now that Sheriff Greb had been working on Rudy's case the day that he was killed. He dug up enough evidence to clear McCain on the rustling charge. All Rudy had to do that night was stay in jail, and he'd have been a free man in the morning. He wouldn't have gone to the pen at all. Now he's got a murder charge to beat." "That's it," Rip said. "That's the part one wants to straighten out. Rudy never had nothing to do with that murder. I was the one who killed Greb. 20 minutes after 2. And Rudy McCain was in the Alamogordo jail, and he was facing a murder charge." It was tough on Rudy, but Rip wasn't thinking of Rudy McCain just now. He was thinking of a girl. But when a man's hands were tied behind him, there wasn't much that he could do but talk and stall for time and pray that young Don Eakin might get back with help before it was too late. He had the fat man's interest now. But Rich Nettle had come back into the room, and Nettle was getting nervous. "Let's clean it up and get out of here," Rich Nettle said. But Banjo Jenkins held up a flabby hand. "Easy, Rich." He looked at Rip. "You say you killed Greb, friend?" Rip nodded. He had been talking for time, building up the story as he went along, and now the parts were falling into place. "I killed him. I was holding a gun on him while Rudy made his getaway. And Greb dived at me and tried to get my gun, and I killed him. And I'd take it kindly if you'd let me put it all down in a confession before I cash in my chips. I'd hate to see Rudy McCain hang for something I did." "I like your nerve, Rip," said Banjo Jenkins. "I always did admire to see a man with nerve. I reckon if you want to write out a confession—" "This is dynamite, Banjo," Rich Nettle said. "Let's clean up and get out of here." "Now don't be nervous, Rich," said Banjo Jenkins. "After all, it isn't much he asks. I wouldn't be able to sleep well at nights, knowing I'd refused a dead man's last request. Get him a pencil and some paper. And cut him loose, Rich. You can hold a gun on him while he writes." They untied Rip's hands. Rich Nettle got paper and a pencil from the desk across the room. While Banjo Jenkins played with the gun, Rip began to write, "I, Rip, being of sound mind." Jenkins was looking over his shoulder. "This is a confession, Rip, not a will," he snapped. "Give me time," Rip said. "I want to get it right. I, Rip Campbell, being of sound mind, do hereby confess that I was the man who helped Rudy McCain break out of the Alamogordo jail. I was the man who killed Sheriff Greb. Rudy McCain had nothing to do with it. I was holding a gun on the sheriff while Rudy made his getaway." The lookout man came from the porch. His face was white and strained. "Someone riding around Lizard Head." "Banjo. Riding this way." The fat man's voice gurgled in his throat. "Who is it?" "Too far away to tell. Half a dozen riders." Rich Nettle flowed into sudden action. He went across the room in long strides, his gun swinging in his hand. He went out onto the porch, and the fox-faced little lookout followed him. Rip saw the smaller man pointing. And Big Rip knew that here was a chance that might not come again. For now, and for just a moment, he was alone in the living room with Banjo Jenkins. He didn't know what Banjo Jenkins was doing, because the fat man was behind him and hadn't moved in his tracks. There wasn't time to try to find out now. Rip came out of his chair like a man propelled by springs. He whirled on Banjo Jenkins. And he saw then that for one time in his life, the fat man's icy poise had deserted him. The fat man had forgotten Rip. His gun was dangling in his hand, and he was staring out through the open door. He turned as Rip leaped to his feet, and frantically he tried to swing his gun around. But Rip threw himself at the fat man in a long dive, and his shoulder knocked Banjo Jenkins off balance, just as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. The bullet missed. Jenkins didn't get a second chance. Rip crashed his fist to Jenkins's face, and every ounce of his weight was riding behind the blow. That solid smash drove the fat man backward, sent him toppling to the floor. Rip leaped for the open door. The door shut, just as Rich Nettle started back into the house. There was a key in the lock. He turned it. He heard Nettle drive his shoulder against the door once and again, and then bullets ripped through the panels in a fusillade of crashing sound. And almost at his feet, Rip saw the gun which little Uncle Wilmort must have drawn just before he died. It was lying on the floor just beyond the little man's outstretched hand. He stooped and grabbed the gun. Across the room, a Colt roared twice, and lead slugs thudded into the wall above his head. He spun around to see broken-nosed Saul, firing at him from the hallway door. He thumbed 2 shots at Saul, and saw the man break at hip and knees, and go down in a heap. And he saw Banjo Jenkins, huge as a bear, shoving ponderously up from the floor. He saw the banjo lift a gun. It was life and death then, and he shot the fat man twice at point-blank range. Blood gushed in a stream frothed the thick column of Banjo Jenkins's throat. The fat man went over with blood bubbling on his lips. Rip grabbed a moment then to reload his gun. He was thumbing shells into the cylinder when he saw a flitting shadow drift past a window, and he knew that someone was running around the house. Swiftly he crossed the room, slipped down the hallway. He had reached the kitchen when he saw the back door opening slowly. He waited. He saw a head thrust cautiously around the door. It wasn't Nettle, it was the fox-faced little rider who had served as lockout. Rip smashed 2 shots through the door, in line with the head. It disappeared from sight. He crossed the kitchen, slammed the door, and shoved the latch home. He ran back toward the living room, and met Eileen Eakin in the hall. The girl's hands were still bound behind her back, and he took time to cut the rope. Her blue eyes were bright with excitement. What's happening? Hell broke loose, he said. He gave her a reassuring grin. Help's coming now. I think we win. But keep back, Rich Nettle is still around somewhere. They went through to the big living room together. There was still no sign of Nettle, but through the window they saw mounted men riding up into the yard. Rip looked at the girl. Stay back, Eileen. I'm going to open the door. He turned the key in the lock, jerked the door wide. Some half-dozen riders were swinging down from saddle, walking toward the house. A chunky, heavy-shouldered man walked in front. It was Ben Dettle. And then Rip saw big Rich Nettle slide around a corner of the house and walk to meet the posse. Nettle's harsh voice floated back. I'm glad you gents showed, Dettle, Rich Nettle said. We found the money that Leaf Eakin stole from the bank. And we got the cur who killed Sheriff Greb dead to rights. Chapter 6. Rip sat in the office of the Alamogordo jail, with handcuffs on his wrists. He had been in this office but once before, but that one time had served to imprint each detail of the room indelibly across his brain. Sheriff Greb was dead now, and Ben Dettle was the new sheriff, but in the office itself there was no change. There was the same battered desk, the same swinging lamp overhead, the same stove which Sheriff Greb's head had struck that night when Rip had knocked him down. That time, there had been Greb and Rudy McCain and himself here in the room. Now Greb was dead, and Rudy McCain was back again behind iron bars in the jail, and the office was filled with the men who had made up that posse which had ridden with Ben Dettle to the Star Cross. Crippled Don Eakin was here, and his sister, and big Rich Nettle was seated in a chair with handcuffed hands folded across one knee. Rich Nettle it was who had found Sheriff Greb dead that night, here in this very room. Rip kept remembering that all the time Nettle was talking. And Nettle was talking pretty steadily. He was lying like a cornered horse thief, but it was beginning to look as if he might be putting it across. The banjo had figured for a long time that Eakin might have hidden that money at the ranch, Nettle was explaining. He figured young Eakin knew about it, that the kid was lying low until the fuss died down. Then he'd take the money and join his dad. Don Eakin broke in on him, harsh-voiced. "You killed my dad, Nettle. You told me about it today, out in Jim Turpin's cellar. You bragged about it." Nettle's dark glance rested on the crippled youth. "You're lying, son," Rich Nettle said, and his eyes turned back to Sheriff Ben Dettle. So the banjo thought if he could get young Eakin to talk. Dettle's face was stony. "Was that why you burned the kid's fingers?" "Banjo did that," Rich Nettle said. "I didn't like it much myself, but Banjo was the boss. And Leaf Eakin had stolen $100,000, and the banjo had lost a lot of money himself when the bank went bust, and he figured the kid knew where it was. He was sore about it. You were trying to locate this money to turn it over to the bank," said Sheriff Dettle. "Sure. Banjo was one of the directors of the bank, you'll remember. I was just working for him." "You're lying," Eileen Eakin cried out suddenly. "It's all lies. You and Banjo Jenkins meant to steal that money. I heard you talking. And you shot poor Uncle Will." Dettle looked at the dark man. "What about that, Nettle?" "Mort was one of them," Rich Nettle rasped. "When we rode up to the house he tried for a gun, and I shot in self-defense. He was as deep in it as the rest." Rip sat quietly in his chair and watched that dark-faced man admiringly, for Nettle was revealing talents entirely unsuspected. Rich Nettle was on thin ice now and knew it, but he was skating skillfully. And Rip watched the black-mustached man and mused on a matter that had troubled him since the first time he had laid eyes on Nettle. Somewhere he had seen that face before. It came to Rip all at once, just like that, and with it came the memory of another time in this same room when he had stood with eyes glued to the narrow slot of a door and watched an old man with iron-gray hair sort papers on a desk. On that night when he had helped Rudy McCain break out of jail, they had stood in the dark jail corridor and watched the old sheriff sorting papers on that desk across the room. The sheriff had put one paper aside, and the rest he had shoved into an inside pocket of his long black coat, and then he had taken his coat off and hung it on a wooden peg on the wall. Rip lifted his eyes, and he saw that the coat still hung where Greb had placed it on the night he died. Rip stood up. Dettle glanced at him curiously. "I guess," Rip said, "Rudy has told you what happened the night we broke the jail." Dettle's face was hard. "He told us a yarn," he said. "He never told us how Sam Greb got a bullet hole between his eyes." "It was Nettle who found Greb." Dettle nodded. "Yeah, Rich found him. He was dead then." "Wait," Rip said. He went across the room and took the black coat from the wall. He was gambling now, because he couldn't be sure of what he'd find, but he shoved a hand into an inside pocket and brought out a bunch of papers. And then he knew that he had won. He put the coat back on the peg. He crossed to the desk and laid a single sheet of paper before Ben Dettle. It was a reward poster. At the top in big black letters ran the legend "Wanted" for murder. And below was the picture of a man, followed by paragraphs of print. "Ever see that face before?" Rip asked. It was the face of a young man, but it wasn't very clear. Ben Dettle looked it over thoughtfully. "I don't seem to place it right off," he said. "Got a pencil?" Rip asked. Dettle had a pencil. He handed it to the cowboy. Rip made a few soft lead strokes across the picture. When he pushed it back, the pictured face had a black mustache. "Would you recognize it now?" "Nettle," Ben Dettle cried. "Rich Nettle, sure as hell." Rip spoke softly, regretfully. "Rudy and I left Greb lying on the floor, with another picture just like that one lying on the floor beside his hand. That was how Nettle found him. He wasn't dead then. He was just stunned from hitting his head against the stove. He wasn't dead until Rich Nettles saw the picture. There was a flutter of commotion across the room. Rich Nettles was standing now. His manacled wrists were crossed, but in one hand he held a gun. In that moment when attention had been distracted, the dark man had grabbed a gun from the closest holster. He was backing toward the door now, the gun swinging in a short arc before him. "Hold it, everybody," he snarled. "I'll kill the man that moves." And a gun roared. But it wasn't Nettles' gun. It wasn't Nettles' gun because that gun was slipping from the big man's fingers, and Rich Nettles' handcuffed hands were out before him, in the blind, instinctive gesture of a falling man, and a small patch of blood was spreading wider on Nettles' forehead, just above his glaring eyes. Then he went down. Across the room, Don Eakin's face was ashen. Smoke was curling upward from the barrel of the gun in the crippled boy's hand. "He killed my father," Don Eakin said. "He belonged to me." "I reckon you go free," Sheriff Dettel told Rudy McCain. This was somewhat later, when they had brought the big, raw-boned, freckle-faced man into the office. "Sam Greb had cleared up that rustling charge against you before he died, and now this Rip gent has straightened out the murder business. Seems like you two Jaspers still ought to be guilty of something, but I reckon the books are balanced. Rip here." He glanced around, but Rip wasn't here. He wasn't in the office. Someone spoke. Rip and Eileen Eakin were talking. They walked out together. "If you ask me, I think that Jasper's in love." Ben Dettel scowled. "He's still handcuffed," he said, somewhat moved. "Maybe he doesn't know it. Maybe somebody better go out and rope him. Love or no love, he's got to bring them handcuffs back."